Bibliophiles of the internet, today is all about queer horror books. I'm going to recommend 10 of my favorites from recent years and also share 10 that are on my TBR that you may also want to put on yours. Let's start with a recent favorite of mine that I can't seem to pass up recommending every single chance I get. I am, of course, talking about The Transition by Logan Ashley Kisner. This came out towards the end of last year. It's a YA paranormal horror story about a young trans boy named Hunter who finally got top surgery over winter break, and now that he's recovered enough, he's looking forward to going back to school and finishing out his last year of high school looking and feeling like himself. However, one night he's viciously attacked by a wild animal to the point where he's not convinced that he's going to survive, but he quickly realizes that not only are his injuries mysteriously healing themselves, but his body might be slowly but surely transforming into a werewolf. This novel is so dark, so gritty, so in your face, and I think if you've historically enjoyed anything written by Andrew Joseph White, then you have a really good chance of enjoying this. There's so much I could say about this, but it makes a really remarkable and powerful statement about how those hideously awkward in-between stages that can come with physical transition can make trans people feel less than human, and because of that, the idea of transitioning into a monster or a werewolf is the perfect metaphor for that experience. I said this in my initial review, but I think we really need more stories like this that are not afraid to depict the violence and discomfort of transition and also force detransition as its own kind of horror, because it is, and it can be in some cases. Another queer horror book I think about all the time is Our Share of Night by Mariana Enriquez, translated by Megan McDowell from the original Spanish. This is a very ambitious, very girthy novel that blends together horror, fantasy, and historical fiction. It's set primarily in Argentina between the 70s and 80s and follows a man whose wife has recently and tragically passed away, leaving him to raise their young son by himself. Now the father and son are desperately trying to outrun her family, who are essentially members of a death cult. And while the father is deeply connected to this cult, he is determined that his son, Gaspar, does not fall victim to that same fate. The structure of this book is something I think about all the frickin' time. It's truly a puzzle box of a story that's slowly unraveling itself and revealing its center as it progresses. And it's broken up into different parts that are essentially informed by or inspired by different kinds of horror tropes. There's the deadly road trip, the haunted house, the home invasion, the forbidden forest, etc. So because of that, the story hangs together in a really interesting way. This can definitely be a disturbing story at times, but if any of that piques your interest, I would highly recommend it. I'm also a huge fan of Model Home by River Solomon. This is the author's take on a haunted house. It follows the three Maxwell siblings who grew up in a gated neighborhood outside of Dallas where they were the only black family in that affluent neighborhood. And even though on the surface all their neighbors were perfectly polite and welcoming, inexplicable and horrific things began happening to them the second they moved into that house. As adults, all the siblings have moved far away from their childhood home, leaving their parents to live there by themselves, until one day they're told that both of their parents have been found dead in the house, and now they have to return to that childhood home to sort through their parents' affairs and finally confront their past. This is one of those books that's so incredibly fucked up and twisted, but it's also written in a way that's incredibly expressive and evocative. The opening sentence, the opening passage, will immediately draw you in, and it's the kind of story that simply does not let up for a single second or allow the reader to catch their breath until the very last page. Along the same lines, I always recommend Natural Beauty by Ling Ling Huang. This is a strange, mysterious horror story about a nameless main character who studied piano for her entire life and become a very successful musician. But when an accident leaves her parents in a care facility full-time, she has to give up her music and pursue a job selling high-end beauty and wellness products. Not only does this new job allow her to provide for her parents, but it also allows her to step into a world of luxury and privilege. And she's also encouraged to try the products herself. But the more she tries and the more her body begins morphing in these horrific, inexplicable ways, the more she's realizing that something sinister lies beneath all these miracle creams and tinctures. This is another incredibly written book that I think about all the time. It so brilliantly explores how there's such a fine line between beauty and ugliness, and it's that constant tension between the two that really underscores our society's obsession with beauty and upholding impossible and unsustainable beauty standards. And because the main character is both queer and Chinese American, there's a lot of strong commentary here about how those beauty standards and ideals are yet another form of colonial violence that wreak havoc on the bodies and minds of marginalized folks who are especially pushed to assimilate themselves and their bodies to those ideals no matter what it might cost. From one all-time fave to another, of course I have to include Monstrillo by Gerardo Samano Cordova. Every single good thing you've heard about this book is absolutely true. It's a horror story about grief, following a mother named Magos who unfortunately lost her young son. But instead of burying him and moving on, she has this instinct to take a piece of his lung and nurture it back to life. Miraculously, it works, but it becomes clear very quickly that this creature she's brought back to life is both her son and also undeniably something that is not human. And while he gradually comes to resemble her son more and more, if they can't keep him from acting on his violent impulses, then he will inevitably destroy his fragile second chance at life. As I said, this is an incredibly powerful meditation on grief, and it's also very expansively told, following different members of Santiago's family as they're navigating what it means to raise this second iteration of their son, and then eventually following Santiago himself as he tries to understand his place in the world. It's very much a story about living in a world that claims you should not exist, having to carry the label of being monstrous just by virtue of being alive, and daring to live in a world that was not made for you. And for all those reasons and so many more, I think it's an absolutely tremendous book. Even though he doesn't need any further endorsement, certainly not from me and really from anyone, I couldn't make this video without talking about Andrew Joseph White, so I'm going to dial it all the way back and once again wholeheartedly recommend Hell Followed With Us. This was Andrew's debut novel. It's a dystopian horror story about a trans boy named Benji who finds himself on the run from the religious cult that raised him, a cult that just so happens to have unleashed the end of the world and decimated almost the entire global population in the process. Not only that, but this cult has also been experimenting on humans like Benji and purposely infecting them with a solution that will turn them into violent bioweapons that will supposedly help them cleanse the human race. Benji is rescued by a ragtag group of teenagers from what's left of a local LGBTQ center, and he's determined to keep them in the dark about the fact that the cult's bioweapon might just be mutating him into a deadly monster powerful enough to wipe all of humankind from the face of the earth. Andrew Joseph White has obviously made a name for himself as an author who's not afraid to write these gruesome, violent, disgusting, in-your-face horror stories that pull no punches when it comes to the kinds of violent worlds that queer and trans folks especially find themselves in every single day. I feel like each and every one of his books is tackling that concept in its own way, and all of his books are very much macabre love letters to queer and trans readers who are just doing everything they can to survive. And this incredible book was very much the blueprint in that sense. A criminally underappreciated and underread book that I think everyone should know about is Our Hideous Progeny by C.E. McGill. This is a gothic sequel to Frankenstein. It follows Frankenstein's great niece, Mary, who's a scientist within her own right. But because she's a woman and because she doesn't have wealth or connections, she and her husband have not been able to really make a name for themselves. One day, Mary stumbles upon some old family papers that detail her great-uncle's past and his experiments, and she decides that the only way to prove herself as a serious paleontologist is to create and animate a creature of her own. I love this book so much, and I genuinely don't understand why people aren't talking about it all the time. It's legitimately as if Frankenstein was crossed with Jurassic Park, and I can think of very few things that are cooler than that. But besides just being very cool conceptually, it's also a powerful commentary on what and whom society deems to be most monstrous. As a queer, childless female scientist, there's a lot of ways that Mary has been made to feel unnatural or even inhuman herself, and all of that very much informs exactly how much stake she's put into this creature's existence. I would also highly recommend Summer Suns by Lee Mandello. This is a blend of queer dark academia, southern gothic, and horror. It's about two best friends, Andrew and Eddie, who were planning to start the same graduate program in Nashville. But the day before Andrew is supposed to join Eddie at Vanderbilt, Eddie is actually pronounced dead, and the authorities say it's an apparent death by suicide. But Andrew is not convinced that Eddie was actually killed, much less by his own hand. And to make things worse, it seems like he's inherited Eddie's roommates, his classes, his unfinished research on Southern ghost stories, and the gruesome phantom of Eddie himself, who is hellbent on exacting revenge. I believe when this book first came out, the official pitch was The Secret History meets The Fast and the Furious, which I would actually say is a pretty accurate pitch. Those are very much the vibes, and this is one of those chaotic stories full of rage and violence and toxicity that you simply cannot look away from. If you're in the market for a dark, twisted story about toxic gays and abhorrently mutual, destructive obsession that's so powerful it can haunt you from beyond the grave, then you should definitely give this a try. A more recent read of mine that I really enjoyed was A Guest in the House by E.M. Carroll. This is an adult graphic novel about Abby, who recently got married to a widowed dentist who just moved to town with his daughter after the death of his first wife. And as she tries to adjust to married life, she starts learning more and more about her husband's first marriage. The more she learns about his first wife, the more she begins to question her husband's past and wonder whether his first wife truly died a natural death. And the more she investigates, the more this first wife's memory seems to morph into some kind of sentient force that Abby finds herself falling for against all odds. This is a really beautifully and thoughtfully composed graphic novel. The way the panels are structured really echoes how Abby as a character feels so isolated and empty on the inside, which is really reflected by the story's manipulation of both white and black space. The story also really speaks to how Abby almost feels like a ghost haunting herself in some ways, because there's a queer version of herself that she's locked away in the back of her mind, and her unwillingness to see the obvious very nicely parallels how she's reluctant to look too hard at the truth of her husband's past. This is a really compelling graphic novel in so many different ways, so I think it absolutely has its place on this list. Lastly, for this section, I'm going to throw a bit of a curveball and end with a nonfiction book called It Came from the Closet, edited by Joe Velisi. This is actually an anthology of nonfiction essays written by queer and trans writers. Every writer in this collection has chosen a popular horror movie, either classic or contemporary, and does a deep dive exploring how that particular film has informed their own understanding and experience of queerness. I really love how this collection is put together. Every single writer does such a great job of not only summarizing their film of choice, but weaving that together with their own personal experiences and very thoughtfully putting to words why these stories of darkness and sorrow and fear can be really well understood through a queer lens for so many different reasons. There's a real variety of thought on display that I think really solidifies this collection as an essential read in so many ways. Now that I've run through some of my favorite queer horror books, I'm going to look ahead at queer horror books that are on my own TBR. Some have already been released and others are set to come out soon or at some point in 2026. These are also going to be a bit more rapid fire because obviously I haven't read them yet, so I can't really give an endorsement or share my thoughts. Starting with a recent release called The Sawmouth by Cale Plett. This is a YA horror story following a genderqueer teen named Cedar who's already survived one near apocalypse that was originally known as the Fall but eventually came to be known as Autumn. What happened was that these fragments of tortured souls somehow woke up inside of complex machines and different forms of technology, which has pushed back technology by decades as a result. 10 years after the onset of Autumn, Cedar moves to this nowhere town of Sawblade Lake, and as they try to settle in, they realize that a shadow might be haunting them, and it's desperate enough to try and break Cedar in any way that it can. I honestly don't really know what that means, but it's a really interesting concept, and I'm curious to see how those two pieces, the techno-apocalypse and being hunted by a murderous shadow creature, are connected in the story. I'm also very curious about a book called From the Belly by Emmett Nahill. This is a nautical horror story about a whaling vessel that's just made a very strange catch. They've been able to reel in a massive whale, which is par for the course, but it turns out that this whale contains a still living man within the lining of its stomach, and the main character, Isaiah, has been tasked with keeping this man alive. Oddly enough, their relationship begins to grow, but it's quickly accompanied by a series of mysterious accidents, injuries, and even deaths that begin to plague the ship and its crew. And eventually it gets to a point where Isaiah will have to confront the sea's vengeance made flesh and choose between this strange new love and the fate of the ship itself. I read a queer horror graphic novel from Emmett Nahill a few years back called Let Me Out that I thought was pretty cool. It made me want to see what other kinds of stories might be brewing in their dark, twisted mind, and I believe this might also be their first full-length story told in prose, so I would very much like to see what it's all about. I believe I heard about this next book when it was named as a Stonewall Honor book. That was He's So Possessed with Me by Corey Liu. This is a supernatural YA horror story about a boy named Colin who sneaks into a club with his best friend Ren, and the only thing he remembers about how the night ended was that they were harassed by some boys on the way home, and then a ghost emerged from the trees, reaching out towards Ren. Colin has no memory of what came next, but all he knows is that Ren has been different ever since that night, and the mysterious new guy that Ren claims to be falling for doesn't seem to be who he says he is. I love a good queer possession story, so honestly, I don't need to know anything else. Another book I added to my TBR last year was Herculine by Byron Grace. This is a trans horror story about a trans woman who's used to confronting demons and protecting herself from the supernatural, but then a malevolent force begins stalking her through the streets of New York City and she becomes desperate to escape. So she runs away to Indiana where her ex has started this all-trans girl commune in the middle of the forest. Even though there's a definite sense of camaraderie growing in this commune, something about it still seems off to the main character. She notices that people will stop talking when she enters a room, there's some kind of unspoken secret that everyone knows about except her, and what once seemed like an escape from the chaos might actually just be a trap in and of itself. I haven't actually seen many people reviewing this, but from what I've heard, I know it's a dark, twisted, chaotic, fucked up story, and those will always pique my interest. It's kind of shameful that I haven't gotten to this next book yet because it's by one of my favorite Latina authors, but I still very much want to read If We Survive This by Raquel Marí. This is the author's first foray into horror and apocalyptic fiction. It's pitched as The Walking Dead meets Yellow Jackets and follows a girl named Flora who, despite being a fearful and often soft-hearted creative, has made it a year and a half into the zombie apocalypse. Now that her mom is dead and her dad has gone missing, she lives with her older brother Kane, and the two of them decide that their best bet at surviving, and maybe even seeing their dad again, would be to make their way to a secluded cabin in Northern California that their family used to rent out every summer vacation. But of course, they'll have to survive the long and dangerous journey first. It's been a second since I've read a story about the zombie apocalypse, but I think this one could be really great. Like I said, it's the first deviation from contemporary fiction that Raquel has taken since her debut, so I'm very curious to see what her take on zombies and grief horror can really look like. Now we're on to the 2026 releases, the first of which is already out as of the filming of this video. That is Muñeca by Cynthia Gomez, which came out on June 2nd. This is a queer Latina Gothic horror story set in Oakland during the late 1960s and following Natalia Fuentes, who's been hearing rumors about this young Spanish heiress named Violeta who's been left paralyzed after a mysterious illness. But Nati is not convinced that it's actually due to illness. She believes it's the work of dark magic. Armed with a plan to break the spell and earn herself a handsome reward in the process, Nati gains entry to the house by posing as one of Violeta's caretakers, and though she soon discovers that her instincts were correct, now she has to figure out who would want to curse Violeta and why. This is another case where I don't really need to be sold on a sapphic Latina Gothic horror story. I would happily read this any day of the week. This next book also recently just came out a few days ago if you're watching this video the week that it's uploaded. That was Doe by Rebecca Barrow, which just came out on June 23rd. To me, this book feels very reminiscent of I Feed Her to the Beast and the Beast is Me. It's a YA horror story about a cheer captain named Maris who is super popular and seen as a strong leader on her team. But outside of school and cheer, Maris's personal life is pretty bleak. Her mom is depressed, her father is absent, and she has a sneaking suspicion that her girlfriend doesn't actually love her, even though that's what she says. And when a newcomer named Genevieve joins the cheer squad and is deemed the team's new golden girl, suddenly it feels like the only good thing Maris has going on in her life is threatening to slip away. One night while she's sleepwalking, Maris is visited by a horrible ancient beast that appears in the shape of a deer. This creature, known as Doe, is searching for a way to free itself from a curse, and Maris might be the only person who has the power to free it, while also unleashing unspeakable power of her own. These last three books I'm going to mention all come out later this year during the fall, starting with Quaint Folk by Bitter Corella, which comes out on October 6th from Orbit. This is a folk horror story about a stay-at-home mom named Jessica who seems to have a perfectly normal and satisfying life. She's married to a good man with a respectable job, they're raising a son together who they adore, but deep down she feels like something is horribly wrong with her and she fears that she can't escape her past. Her husband's job eventually forces them to move abroad to this small island where people grow their own food, make their own jam, and ultimately mind their own business. Jessica very badly wants to feel like she's deserving of these neighbors and this small town life, but as she tries to befriend the townsfolk and learn their ways, she's realizing that something rotten and evil might be buried beneath the town's sickly sweet surface. Then we have a sapphic horror romance called Lethal Kiss by Taylor Groth, which comes out on October 20th from Tor Nightfire. This is pitched as Jennifer's Body meets Ninth House. It's about an academic named Marcella who just got hired at Preston University, where she plans to lay low, enjoy the university's many amenities, and maybe feast on a few of her coworkers between classes. But one day a professor is found dead and it definitely was not her doing. So it turns out there might just be another more dangerous monster lurking on campus. Lastly for today, I just want to say I'm super excited for C.G. Drew's next book, Scorpion Deep, which comes out on October 27th from Fievel and Friends. This is another YA horror story from C.G. Drew's. It's about a boy named Jonathan who desperately wants to leave behind the dreary isle he calls home. And while all his friends are looking forward to starting college on the mainland, they're not aware that Jonathan was never actually accepted in the first place. Terrified of being left behind, Jonathan decides to pay a tithe to Scorpion Deep, an eldritch sea god who many of the locals believe to be nothing more than a myth. Shockingly, the ritual actually works, and despite his terror, Jonathan can't help but feel drawn towards this otherworldly, ageless entity that seems to be every bit as obsessed with him in return. Again, I don't exactly need my arm twisted when it comes to queer horror books involving eldritch monsters, obsession, and horrifying transformations. I know I haven't read anything from C.G. Drew's yet, but I actually own their three most recent releases, and I just have a really good feeling about their books. So there you have it. Those are 20 queer horror books that you can add to your TBR. As always, this is just a small sampling of what's out there. There are so many other fantastic queer horror books that have been released and that we still have to look forward to. So if there are any others that you would like to recommend, feel free to drop them down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.